All right, let's just jump right in with a huge question. How much control do you really have over your life? We all think about it. Well, today we're digging into a pretty radical answer from one of history's most influential and, let's be honest, controversial thinkers, John Calvin. We're going to break down his startling view on human will and God's total absolute sovereignty over, well, everything. It's an idea that sparked debate for centuries, and you can still feel its impact today. So let me just ask you straight up. Who's really in charge of your decisions? When you pick what to eat, or what to say, or which path to take, is that choice really truly your own? According to John Calvin, the answer is a firm, and for many, a pretty shocking no. So to get our heads around his logic, we're going to walk through 5 key ideas. We'll start with a powerful metaphor about a horse and 2 riders, then a wild case study with 3 different actors all behind a single event. After that, we'll tackle the intense idea of divine hardening, see God's role in our everyday choices, and finally, look at a complete rethink of what freedom even is. Okay, first up, let's start with a really powerful analogy. To understand the human will, Calvin actually borrows this striking image from an earlier theologian, Augustine. The metaphor is simple but incredibly powerful. Just picture the human will as a horse. The horse itself doesn't choose where to go, it's always being guided by a rider. Now, if God is in the saddle, that horse is guided with skill and purpose. But if the devil takes the reins, it's just driven wildly towards ruin. The absolute key here is this: the horse is never without a rider. But here's where Calvin makes a super important distinction. He says we sin by necessity, not by compulsion. Now, what on earth does that mean? Well, compulsion is like being forced to do something you don't want to do. But necessity, for Calvin, means that because of our basic nature, we voluntarily, even eagerly, choose the wrong path. The will is so captivated by sin that it actually wants to obey its wicked rider. All right, let's build on that with a fascinating, kind of mind-bending case study. This is where the logic gets really interesting, because the question is, how can God, Satan, and a person all be responsible for the exact same evil act without making God the author of that evil? So Calvin turns to the famous story of Job. Job, this super righteous guy, has his flock stolen and his workers killed by a gang of raiders, the Chaldeans. On the surface, it looks like a simple crime, but Calvin says, hold on, there are actually 3 distinct actors at work here. And just look at how this breaks down. First, you've got God. His purpose is righteous, to test the patience of his servant, Job. Then you have Satan, and his purpose is totally malicious, to push Job into despair so he curses God. And finally, you've got the Chaldeans, who are just driven by good old-fashioned greed. 1 event, 3 completely different motives. And right there, that's the key that unlocks Calvin's whole argument. It is all about the purpose, the motive. God uses evil instruments to achieve his own good and righteous ends, while Satan and the Chaldeans are just acting out of their own wicked desires. That difference in intent is everything. It's how Calvin says God can be involved without being guilty of evil. Now, this brings us to another key term in Calvin's world: hardening. You know, when the Bible says God hardened Pharaoh's heart in the story of Exodus, Calvin says that's not just God passively stepping back and letting it happen. No, he sees it as an active, direct, divine judgment. He actually breaks it down into a 2-step process. So first, God withdraws his spirit, which is the only source of light and good, leaving a heart to naturally, turn to stone. But then it gets even more direct. God actively delivers that person over to Satan, using him as the minister of his wrath to basically lock them into their own rebellion. And Calvin isn't just pulling this out of thin air. He points right to the text. God states his purpose plainly. I will harden his heart. This isn't some accident or a side effect. It's done for a very specific reason, so that the bigger divine plan can unfold. It's about as clear, active, and purposeful an intervention as you can get. Okay, so we've seen God's hand in these massive, dramatic, world-changing events. But what about, the small stuff, the everyday choices? Well, Calvin's argument is that this divine control extends to every single mundane, morally neutral choice we make. And he just rattles off examples. Who made the Egyptians suddenly feel like lending their valuables to the Israelites as they were leaving? God did. Who calms the hearts of otherwise savage nations so they show unexpected mercy?
God does. Who gives a commander a sudden surge of courage right before a battle? You guessed it, God does. For Calvin, there's literally nothing that happens outside of this direct divine influence. This quote from Solomon is really the capstone for this whole idea. The logic is just so simple. If the will of a king, the most powerful, seemingly independent person on earth, is like a stream of water that God can just redirect wherever he wants, then whose will could possibly be free from that same control? So, all of this leads us to the final, and let's be real, the most challenging piece of this whole puzzle. If God is directing every single one of our desires and actions, what on earth happens to human free will? Does it even exist anymore? According to Calvin, most of us argue about free will in completely the wrong way. He says true freedom isn't about whether you can actually succeed in doing what you want out in the real world. That's just a matter of power or circumstances. Instead, Calvin wants us to split the idea in two. There's the internal world of our will and the external world of our actions. He'd say we are free in the sense that we have judgment, we have desires, we truly want things. Whether or not we have the power to actually get them, that's a completely different question. And to really hammer this point home, he uses this shocking, kind of brutal example. He compares a Roman general, Attilius Regulus, being tortured to death inside a spiked barrel with the all-powerful Emperor Augustus Caesar. And he says, Regulus has no less free will. Why? Because even trapped in that cask, his will is still internally free to want to escape. He has zero external power, but his internal will is just as active as the emperor's. And that leaves us right here in the middle of the central tension of Calvin's entire argument. He says, yes, we have a will, and yes, we choose things voluntarily. But at the same time, he says God directs that will to achieve his own sovereign purposes. So we end with this question. If our will is internally free to desire whatever it wants, but its ultimate direction is guided by a higher power, what does our freedom truly mean?